This video is supported by Brilliant.org. Hi. Before I get into today's topic, I want to do something I don't normally do on this channel. I want to just kind of like editorialize a little bit. I've been doing this channel now for almost 5 years, and anybody who's been following this whole time, anybody who goes back and watches my videos from 2014, 2015, can probably tell that there's been a bit of a shift in my level of skepticism. I covered things, a while back, like the Global Consciousness Project. That a lot of you guys liked that one. And I even interviewed a guy that was sort of involved in it. And I remember in the interview I said something to the effect that skepticism itself can sort of be its own dogma, because a lot of scientific ideas that don't fit into, the mold that we already have, that don't really jibe with the scientific establishment, a lot of times that can be just sort of shoved out the door. And yeah, I mean, this can be applied to a lot of things, and history is littered with discoveries that changed the way we see the world that at the time totally went against the conventional wisdom. And I made the argument a few different times that, if you don't at least look into these, outside the parameters ideas, then science can't move forward, because if you're always playing inside the same box and you never step outside of that and try something new and look at new ideas, then there's no way for anything to grow from there. And there's a part of me that does still believe this. I think there is some merit to that argument, but the longer I've been doing this channel and the more I've researched all these topics and looked into them and kind of followed all the rabbit holes and everything, the more I've come to just sort of align myself with the scientific consensus. It's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? The idea that the less knowledgeable you are in a subject, the more confidence you have in it, and then that confidence kind of goes away the more you find out how much you don't know. So it was really easy for me 5 years ago to sort of challenge the scientific establishment, because I hadn't really researched a lot of these topics and I hadn't really looked into them that much. And then the more that I did, the more I realized, oh, no, I have no basis to stand on here. I have no bona fides to challenge what these people are thinking. So yeah, I've generally come to just sort of trust the scientific consensus on things, because for every single subject that I look into, there are literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of people out there who have dedicated their lives to understanding this. And if those people have come to somewhat of an agreement, or a majority of them believe something, it would be the height of arrogance for me, somebody who hasn't spent any more than, a fraction of my time looking into it, to challenge what they have to say about it. I do still think that skepticism can become dogmatic and pervasive and kind of blind us to possibilities that maybe we aren't looking at because we're so stuck inside the box that we've constructed. I do think that everything should be researched. I don't think there's anything more scientific than that. In the end, I will always align myself with the scientific consensus. And if new information comes up and the scientific consensus changes, I will change right along with that. All of that is to say that today's video is on a subject that most people consider to be junk science or pseudoscience, but I'm going to approach this with as much of an open mind as possible, and I invite you to do the same, because some of this is pretty interesting. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about cold fusion. I've covered fusion energy on this channel before, but just as a quick refresher, fusion energy is when two atoms smash together and fuse into a new element, usually producing a whole lot of energy, and usually done in situations of high pressure and temperature. Now this is obviously the opposite of nuclear fission. That's when one atom is split into two atoms and releases energy that way, and this is what runs the nuclear reactors that power our homes today. Fission reactions are usually done with very high mass atoms like uranium that have hundreds of protons and neutrons in them, and fusion is usually done with hydrogen because it has the lowest mass. It's literally one proton, one electron. You fuse those together and you get helium with 2 protons. Hydrogen fusing into helium is exactly what powers our sun, and it happens because the mass of the sun is so big and the gravity is so strong that it's actually able to push these 2 protons together, which they repel each other because they're both positively charged, but this smashes them so hard that they actually eventually do fuse in together. This boundary that I'm talking about that get past the electromagnetic barrier, this is called the Coulomb barrier, and it takes a lot of energy and pressure to do this. So in fusion reactors, we're basically trying to replicate conditions inside the sun with using a superheated plasma, and that kind of flings these hydrogen ions around, hopefully to smash them together fast enough to overcome that barrier. Of course, the big problem with nuclear fusion, so far anyway, is that it doesn't really work as an energy source because it actually requires more energy to create than we actually get out of it, which kind of defeats the purpose. There's a lot of experiments and projects trying to sort of chip away at this problem, and hope does spring eternal. Now this is, of course, hot fusion, and by hot, I mean very hot, like surface of the sun hot. This is not something you would have sitting on your desk charging your phone, unless your phone was a Nokia 3310, which of course can survive anything. For that, you want something that can produce energy at room temperatures. Cold fusion. But cold fusion got such a bad rap back in the day for reasons that I will explain in just a second, that proponents of the technology have sort of rebranded it to LENR, which stands for low energy nuclear reactions. Although sometimes it stands for lattice enabled nuclear reactions. It's kind of used interchangeably. The idea is this. You get a jar, you fill the jar with an electrolytic solution of lithium salts and heavy water. I need to explain heavy water real quick. Water, as you all know, is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom. Now heavy water is the same thing, but the 2 hydrogen atoms are actually deuterium. So what's deuterium, you may be asking? Well, deuterium sounds really exotic, but it's really just an isotope of hydrogen that has a neutron and a proton. So it has 2 particles in its nucleus, 2 like duet, like duet, like dual, right? Deuterium. You get it. Since it has twice the mass of regular hydrogen, sometimes it's called heavy hydrogen, hence heavy water. By the way, whenever you hear people talking about fusing hydrogen atoms into helium atoms, what they're really talking about is deuterium, because you kind of need that extra neutron in there to, go with the 2 protons when it becomes helium. So, okay, I'm glad we had that talk. Next, you add some electrodes, a negative anode of palladium surrounded by positive cathodes of platinum. Once you introduce some voltage, it creates an electric current that strips deuterium atoms off of the heavy water molecules, creating a negatively charged OD positive ion and a positively charged deuterium ion. A positively charged deuterium ion is basically a proton and a neutron with no electron. And since it's positively charged, it's attracted to the negatively charged palladium anode. Once there, it absorbs an electron and becomes neutralized. But something interesting happens at the anode at the atomic level. The palladium in the anode is arranged in a cubic lattice, and the gaps between the atoms in this structure are big enough for the tiny deuterium atoms to slip into. As more and more deuterium atoms are attracted to the negative anode, they stack up and push inward, forcing more and more of the deuterium into the palladium, kind of saturating it. And saturating it actually makes that palladium metal sort of expand a little bit because you're filling it with deuterium atoms. And here's where they put the squeeze on it. By oscillating the current in the anode, you can cause that palladium to expand and contract due to the pressure of the deuterium atoms surrounding it. This increases the density of deuterium even further until eventually the deuterium atoms start to fuse into helium. This fusion reaction produces heat, 24 million electron volts for every fusion that occurs. The idea is, of course, you take that heat and can be used to power generators. So when running these experiments, you look for excess heat, helium bubbles, and oxygen bubbles, because when the heavy water molecules break apart, the negatively charged DO molecule is attracted to the positive cathodes, where it splits up, combines with other free electron atoms, and creates oxygen gas, O2. This, in theory, is how it's supposed to work. And I think if we can put aside the controversy for just a second, we can all agree it's pretty clever. But you may be asking, why all the controversy, Joe? To which I would respond, you're young, aren't you? Senior citizens my age and older remember that a whole thing happened in 1989 where reports came out that cold fusion had happened using this method, and I mean, it was everywhere. And you gotta know the context of the time to really understand why this was such a big deal. The oil embargo of the 1970s, we had this huge oil crisis. We were still kind of reeling from that a little bit in the late 1980s. 3 Mile Island had been a thing not too long before that, so there was a big anti-nuclear movement going on. Global warming as an idea had just kind of been put forward, and it was just starting to get into people's consciousness. And oh yeah, the Exxon Valdez, the biggest oil spill of all time, had literally just happened, like the same week that this was announced. So the idea of a cheap, renewable energy source was big, big news. Plus, just a few years earlier, in like 1985, scientists had discovered high-temperature superconductivity for the first time, which nobody thought was possible, so we might have just been a little bit more open to the possibility at that point. The researchers in the spotlight were Martin Fleischmann of the University of Southampton and Stanley Pons from the University of Utah. They had hypothesized this method of creating cold fusion reactions and were funding the whole thing out of pocket, up to $100,000 they were spending themselves to do this research. And what they found, or claimed to find, while doing these tests was that there would be these spikes in the water temperature. Like the water would be at a steady 30 degrees Celsius, and then out of nowhere it would spike up to 50 degrees Celsius and kind of stay there for a little bit without them adding extra energy into the system. So this extra energy seemed to be coming from somewhere, which was positive and kind of confirm their hypothesis, but they couldn't figure out exactly how to make it happen. It seemed to happen at random times. They couldn't seem to induce it when they wanted it to. So it was a little thing. I mean, it's not like they built Mr. Fusion or anything, but still, it was some good news. So they filed a grant to continue their work and went to publish their paper with Stephen Jones of Brigham Young University. And this is where things took a very wrong turn. The agreement between the three of them was to announce their findings in the journal Nature on March 24th of that year. But Fleischmann and Pons, for reasons that nobody fully understands, some say the University of Utah pressured them to do this so they could get credit for the discovery. They jumped the gun, and they filed their paper with the Journal of Electroanalytical Chemistry on March 11th, and they announced their discovery along with a press release and a gigantic press conference. In other words, it didn't go through the peer review process. And for all those reasons that I listed earlier, the discovery made news all around the world, and Fleischmann and Pons became household names for a while. And that whole thing kind of pissed off Stephen Jones, who parted ways with them and kind of distanced himself from the project. But science and the peer review process that it's based on marches on. And because this was getting so much attention, research labs from all around the world started trying to do this themselves. And you remember the part earlier where I said that they had trouble sort of getting it to reproduce when they wanted it to? Yeah, so did everybody else. Reproducibility is kind of super important in science. You know, if you claim to be able to make artificial life by mixing together chocolate milk and goat pee, and then nobody else can get the same results, I mean, it sounds like a pretty good prank, actually. The point is, this whole thing blew up in their faces, as it should have. You know, whether or not they were able to get it to work is almost irrelevant because they didn't follow the process. There's a reason why things are done this way. So there were countless explanations that other people came up with to explain their findings. Some of them were just simple miscalculations. Some of them had to do with flaws in the palladium. And all this gets more complicated because there apparently were some labs that did validate their hypothesis. A team in Georgia and a team from Texas A&M University got similar results. But over 600 different teams tried this experiment, and only a handful of them got anything that even closely resembled positive results. Some people call the whole debacle fusion confusion, and the word hoax started flying around quite a bit. It didn't help that the University of Utah immediately applied for a grant for $25 million from Congress. The whole thing just started to sound really fishy. And sentiment changed. Everybody was so excited about this. This was such a big deal, and then it just felt like the rug got pulled out from under us. By April 30th, the New York Times pronounced cold fusion dead and called the whole thing a circus. And you know who really don't like to be called clowns? Scientists. The science community turned on this thing hard. The very day after the New York Times article, the American Physical Society had a special session just about cold fusion, and 8 of the 9 speakers declared it dead. And when Stephen Koonin of Caltech called Pons and Fleischmann incompetent and delusional, he got a standing ovation. Ouch. Pons and Fleischmann, I mean, their careers were over. I mean, their names are still punchlines in some circles to this day. And any research into cold fusion dried up completely after that. Nobody wanted to touch it. Well, almost nobody. The University of Utah went ahead and invested $4.5 million to set up a cold fusion research institute. And various independent researchers have tested different angles of the hypothesis over the years, but none of them seem to be able to get any kind of funding for obvious reasons. The idea does still have its supporters, though. They point out some of the anomalies that were done in some of the tests and some of the unexplained things that came out of the flurry of experiments that came up after the announcement was made. And other labs from around the world have been able to get similar results in the years since then. I'll put links to all that in the description below. The best case scenario here is that there's some tiny specific detail that only a handful of labs actually accidentally got right, and if we could figure out what that thing is, it would make all the difference, we could scale it up, and it could change the world. But the other side of that coin is that the number of positive results were so small that it's statistically insignificant, and it's just an anomaly or a miscalculation, and the whole thing is just attributable to nothing more than that. This is the angle that the overall science community has had on this subject since 1989. Do you think that's fair? Tell your whys and why nots in the comment section. But real quick before I bail, there is actually another type of cold fusion that totally works, totally provable, and totally tubular. Because it's from the 80s. It's called muon-catalyzed fusion, and it was first proven by Stephen Jones, the same guy that was working with Fleischmann and Pons from Brigham Young University. He actually made a tiny little splash about this a few years earlier in 1985. But a much smaller one because, you know, he didn't blast it all over the news. Putzes. Anyway, in the air, sometimes electrons and hydrogen atoms can be shared with other hydrogen atoms. They don't really bond with each other, just get caught in each other's electromagnetism. The two nuclei are still positively repelled. And sometimes, and I mean barely, almost never, but sometimes, the two protons can by some fluke get pushed together and fused. Well, muons are subatomic particles that can take the place of electrons, and they carry the same charge, but they're 200 times more massive. So, if you replace the electrons and hydrogen atoms with muons, and then bind two of those together, that combined extra mass pushes the protons closer, making the potential to fuse much higher. So you bombard hydrogen atoms with muons, they can produce fusion at room temperature, and it can actually set off chain reactions, bouncing from one atom to another, fusing them as it goes until it eventually sticks with an atom and stays there. They can do this on average about 150 times before they get stuck. And each fusion event creates roughly 18 mega electron volts for a grand total of 2.7 giga electron volts per muon created. Sounds great! Until you realize that making muons is actually really hard. It's not as simple as mixing chocolate milk and goat pee. Or is it? Yeah, the power it takes to create every muon that you create is about 5 giga electron volts, so you're losing energy for every muon that you create. The good news is it definitely works. It's been thoroughly studied, and this has been repeated over and over and over again. We know it's a real thing. It just takes more energy to create it than you get out of it. It's the hot fusion of cold fusion. But just like hot fusion, people are chipping away at it. If we can find an easier, more efficient way to create muons, if we can find ways to keep them from sticking so that they can create more chain reactions as we go along, this might actually become feasible. Fusion is a moonshot. It's one of these things that just might be a little bit crazy, but if we can pull it off, it could change humanity forever. Cold fusion is more like M-Drive. It's like a double moonshot. Which, if there's not a drink called that, there definitely should be one. Yeah, I mean, people get excited about M-Drive because it's propulsion without fuel. It would literally change everything about how we travel through space, if it worked. So, I mean, even if there's the tiniest chance that we're going to get just a tiny, tiny, tiny positive result out of it, people want to research that. And it's that same mindset of, but what if, that spurs people on to continue to support linear research. So, what do you think? Junk science or worth exploring? Talk about it down in the comments. You know, some of the concepts in this video, you really have to step back a little bit and make sure you have sort of a foundational understanding of the underlying stuff before you can really get it. I try to do that on this channel as much as I can, but some other place that's really good to do that is Brilliant.org. Brilliant is a great sponsor of this channel. You all know that by now, but I don't just talk about it here. I actually do talk about it in person out in the world. The world, when I venture into it. I never leave this room. And I talk about it because it takes things that maybe we studied in school, but we never really understood, or maybe it's just stuff you heard about for years, but you didn't really understand it, so you just kind of tuned it out. But it takes these ideas and it kind of teaches you how to figure it out on your own. There have been so many things that I never really understood back in the day, and then I looked at it through Brilliant's way of doing it, and it suddenly just clicked, and it all made sense, and I was like, oh, that thing I always had such a hard time memorizing. I don't have to memorize it now because I understand how it works. And then they build on that thing, and then build on that thing, and then next thing you know, you're just a big old smarty McSmartface. You can sign up for free at Brilliant.org/AnswersWithJoe and get access to their weekly brain puzzles and teasers and whatnot. And if you sign up for a premium subscription that gives you access to all their courses, the first 200 people get 20% off your subscription for life. Brilliant also has a daily challenges feature that you can go in and check in for a few minutes a day and pump up your brain a little bit, get a little bit smarter. And you can also take these offline, so if you gotta take a trip, or you're not at a place that has some internet, you can still get smarter wherever you are. It's good, it's smart, you'll like it. Brilliant.org/AnswersWithJoe. Link is down in the description. Big thanks to Brilliant for supporting this channel, and a huge shout out to my Answer Files on Patreon who are joining a community, doing great things, and just getting to know each other. It's a fun time. So if you would like to join them, you can go to patreon.org/AnswersWithJoe. But really quick, let me murder some names of some new people that have joined real quick. We got Zachary Bowers, Ryan Erskines, Nicholas J. Whitcamp, Burke Bjartmar, Foundiferous WA, Brian Hobby, John Rumpf, Mark Denson, Vince, Kurt Kaufman, Cultus, Jeremy Frick, Dan Enright, Marks Higgerson, Mr. Fukiyato, David Thomas, Open End, and Greg Hadow. Thank you guys so much. T-shirts as always available at the store, answerswithjoe.com/shirts. Fun, nerdy stuff. I think you'll like them. Please do, if you're the first time here, check out this video. because Google thinks you'll like that, or any of the others that might show up over here. I talk about cool, fun, nerdy, futuristic type stuff every Monday and every Thursday. And if you like what you see, I invite you to subscribe. You'll be the first ones to see them. All right, thanks again for watching. You guys go out now, have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care.